So, if we have a look at the 2023 question level analysis, it's no surprise that the inference questions were the most challenging. We had some tricky inference questions at the beginning of the paper, which slowed some children down, and then there were a couple of questions that I'd like to explore further. Most of you will be aware retrieval, inference, and vocabulary carry the most weighting on the paper. So let's have a look at question 26. Question 26, within that question, 52% of children answered correctly and got the 3 marks, and nearly 80% attempted the question. Now, it was particularly challenging because it was a 3 marker on the second paper. Now, normally you have a 3 marker on the third paper, or 2 3 marks on the third paper. And the last time we had a 3 mark question on the second aspect was in 2016, when pupils and teachers found that test paper challenging as well. So this year, people did find this particular reading paper very challenging. So let's have a look. What do children need to know for that 3 marker? Well, first of all, they need to make a point. And in this case, they were talking about that shouldn't be judged by their appearance. So that's their point or the message that they want to give. And then they need to back it up with some evidence. So in question 26, you had a scaffold, you had an example, and it says, she says, even though they might be scary, they aren't really. So what the children need to do to get the 3 mark is say a point, have evidence, then they need to find another point from the text and then evidence. Now, to clarify, a point can be the positive message, as in question 26. It can be what impression does this character have? What does the atmosphere tell you? Or what are the features of a character? Another inference question that was particularly challenging was question 30. Right at the beginning of the paper, it says, look at page 8. Now, that gives children a real locator to help them to answer the question. Interestingly, it was a multiple choice question, but it did say to tick 2. Now, I know from working with children that very often they might tick 1 when they're giving an answer, but tick 2 is really important. So there are some implications for teaching test technique, circling, ticking the correct amount. Now, 31% of children answered this question correctly, but 95% of children attempted it. And some might have rushed through, looked at multiple choice and ticked it. The answer, however, is over the page 8. So you get the impression of the fading light as you read through the text, and you also get the impression of the weather as you read through the text. And again, the atmosphere is reflecting the mood of the character and what's happening. If we have a look at the 2023 reading test paper, there are several implications for schools. If we take a more forensic look at the test paper, the vocabulary type questions carried 18% of the marks, retrieval and record type questions 32% of the marks, and inference questions 46% of the marks. The others summarising and also identifying how things are put together, 2% respectively. So the first thing I would say in terms of implications is it's important to teach the whole reading curriculum. So reading for pleasure, reading for information, reading fiction, non-fiction and poetry books for children, right the way from nursery, reception, EYFS, so that we're enriching children with the background knowledge they need to really access reading. The other important thing for whole school is to make sure that teachers are reading aloud to children, and not just reading aloud fiction, but just developing that love of reading, modelling fluency, thinking about fiction, non-fiction and books from across the curriculum. Now, if we look at Scarborough's reading rope from 2001, it talks about the key aspects of being a really good strategic reader. So when children are reading, they're drawing on their background knowledge. They're thinking about the vocabulary. They might be asking questions around what puzzles them, or they might be what we call resolving the pronoun. So if it says he, who are they talking about? Who's the character? And they might need to read backwards and read forwards. However, of course, we have this rich and varied reading curriculum, but it's also important to teach children explicitly reading test techniques. So things like circling, ticking, reading the question very carefully, and also just thinking about the question stem and what it's asking you to do. Those are equally as important for pupils. So I think my best advice for preparing pupils for the reading test paper is to practice skimming and scanning under timed conditions. Now, skimming is just about getting the gist of the text. Scanning is looking for particular keywords. And I like to do activities like find and search, Where's Wally, those kind of books where children are really training their eyes to find the answer before that commitment to a print or a printed text. And when they are scanning, get them to think about, is it a proper noun? Are you going to be scanning for capital letters? If it asks you a question about a date, are you going to be looking for particular numbers or days of the week? And just being really explicit about the strategies you need for really good skimming and scanning. My other tip would be to really think about the locators within the question. So if it says, look at paragraph beginning such and such, then the children need to really look at that paragraph. Or if it says, look at page 8, then the children need to look at that particular page. So that's the kind of test technique things. We can read as widely as possible, and of course that's also important. But if they haven't read the correct section, then that can be really challenging for pupils. Now, remember, the answer is always based on the text, so it's not always the children's background knowledge. So I remember a particular SATs paper called Caving, and some children answered based on their knowledge of caving because they'd been caving, but actually they needed to base their answer on the text. So my other tip, or my third tip if you like, would be to really base your answer on the text, on what you actually read. So a question that says in which state, for example, and the children then scan the text, find the word state and think about the answer, that's very, very heavily based on what is written within the text. My other tip would be to really make sure children are really familiar with multiple choice questions. So thinking about if it says tick 1 or tick 2, because that's always something that they find particularly challenging. So that for me, those 4 tips will really support pupils with answering the reading test paper. And finally, one more, rather than reading all of the text, because you typically have 3 texts, I would recommend that we encourage pupils to read one text at a time. Read the text, answer the questions as you go along, the text 1, read the second text, answer the questions as you go along, and then the third text, reading through and answering the questions as you go along. If we're thinking about preparing pupils for the 2024 reading test paper, then I would recommend a number of resources. The first one was thinking about, are we explicitly teaching children how to answer the reading test paper? Now, it's not about teaching to the test, it's about really supporting children to be confident with answering the questions. So when I co-wrote the Achieve Reading, the higher standard and the expected standard, I really thought about breaking down how to answer the questions so that pupils feel confident when they come to particular questions like retrieval, inference, or summarising, and the strategies they need to answer those questions. Now, of course, it's not just about those techniques, making sure that we've got a rich and varied reading for children, so reading fiction, non-fiction and poetry. If we don't have those access to books, then joining libraries and making sure that children have that background knowledge, access a wide range of text.